one night, unspoken tension dissolved the familiar boundaries between us, drawing us into a closeness that would change everything. The house felt different that evening, as though the walls held a quiet secret. Dad had just left for an overnight trip, and with him went the sense of steady normalcy. The silence wasn't unusual, yet tonight it felt deeper, intentional, wrapping around me as I lay on my bed, listening to the faint sounds from the street outside. I was tired, yet sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts drifted, trying to piece together why everything felt so tense. A soft breeze stirred the curtains and the shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching out like dark fingers across the floor. I rolled onto my side, hoping a new position would help me settle. But the pickling feeling that something was about to happen lingered at the back of my mind. A low creak echoed from the hallway. My heartbeat quickened and I strained to listen, telling myself it was probably just the house settling. But then came another sound, a soft, careful footstep. My pulse raced and I found myself holding my breath, listening as the footsteps grew closer. Each step was slow, deliberate, like someone was trying not to be heard. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to brush away the irrational fear bubbling up inside me. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, lingering there in the silence. For a long moment, nothing happened, but the weight of someone's presence was unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine as I lay there, my senses heightened, waiting for the next move. But then, just as suddenly as they'd arrived, the footsteps retreated down the hallway, disappearing into the quiet of the house. I released a shaky breath, trying to dismiss the strange encounter as my mind playing tricks on me. Still, the feeling lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. I tossed and turned, sleep evading me as my ND replayed the sound of those careful footsteps. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. It was hard to tell before exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless slumber. But even then, the night wasn't through with me. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I stirred. A sensation of someone nearby washed over me, unsettling and too close for comfort. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to my restless imagination. But then I felt it, a presence hovering just at the edge of my consciousness. I kept my eyes shut, hoping it was just a dream, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was as if someone was right there, close enough to reach out and touch. Every instinct told me to open my eyes to confront whoever or whatever it was, but fear held me still, trapping me in place. I lay there frozen, my breath shallow as the sensation of being watched intensified. Seconds stretched into eternity, my mind racing with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. I blinked, half expecting to see someone standing by my bed, but the room was empty. Silence filled the space, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. I lay there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of it all. Was it a dream? Had I imagined the whole thing, or was something or someone truly here? Morning light filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow across the room. I sat up, the events of the night replaying in my mind like a half-remembered nightmare. Everything felt surreal, like I was caught between reality and a dream I couldn't fully shake. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the darkness. But deep down, a sliver of unease remained, nagging at the edges of my thoughts. The day unfolded like any other, yet everything felt off. The people around me seemed oblivious, moving through their routines while I drifted in a haze of confusion. I tried to push the memory of that strange night aside, focusing on the familiar rhythm of daily life. But as the hours passed, the memory of that presence, of those footsteps outside my door, kept tugging at my mind, refusing to be dismissed. By evening, I'd managed to convince myself that I was overreacting. It was just a strange night, nothing more. Yet, as the sky darkened and the quiet of the house settled around me once more, that familiar tension crept back in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, to push the unease aside, but it lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. When the night stretched on and the house fell into silence, I felt it again, the same pickling sensation of being watched. I lay there listening to the sighs and groans of the house, each sound magnified in the quiet. Time seemed to slow, stretching out as I waited, unsure what I was waiting for, but unable to ignore the growing sense of dread. And then, just as I thought I could drift off, there was a soft knock on my door. The sound was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. My heart leaped into my throat, and I lay still unsure whether to respond. The knock came again, a little louder, this time more insistent. "Are you awake?" a voice called softly. I recognized the voice immediately. My mom's tone was gentle, almost hesitant, as if she was afraid of disturbing me. I sat up, shaking off the last remnants of sleep, and answered, "Yeah, I'm awake." The door creaked open, and she stepped inside, her figure framed by the dim light from the hallway. She looked at me, a faint smile on her face, though there was something in her eyes. Couldn't quite place. An emotion too subtle to name. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, crossing the room to sit on the edge of my bed. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief at her presence. She didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there looking out the window as if lost in thought. The silence between us was comfortable, a quiet companionship that needed no words. But even as I relaxed, a faint edge of tension lingered, as if there was something she wasn't telling me. After a while, she reached over, brushing a hand over my hair in that gentle, comforting way she always did. "I just wanted to check on you," she murmured, her voice soft. "I know things have been strange lately." Her words hung in the air, and I could feel the unspoken weight behind them. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. Instead, we sat there in the quiet, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. Eventually, she gave me a small smile and stood up, smoothing the blanket over my legs before heading toward the door. "Good night," she said, pausing in the doorway. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, as if she wanted to say something more, but she simply turned and slipped out, leaving me alone in the silence once more. As the door clicked shut behind her, I lay back down, my mind churning with questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. The house was quiet, and yet the weight of the unknown pressed down on me. I closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the sense that something was just out of reach, waiting to reveal itself. The following morning felt even stranger. I'd hoped the night would bring some kind of clarity, that sleep might untangle the web of unease that had settled over me. But as sunlight crept through the blinds, it only seemed to cast light on how different everything felt. I got ready in silence, moving through the motions of the day without really being present. The unsettling feeling from last night lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. At breakfast, Mom was already seated, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands. She looked up as I entered, her expression thoughtful, almost as if she'd been waiting for me for a moment. Our eyes met, and I felt the weight of some unspoken thought behind her gaze. But she didn't say anything, just offered me a quiet smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You sleep all right?" she asked, her tone light, casual, yet I sensed a strange edge to it. I shrugged, grabbing a piece of toast. "Yeah, not really," I admitted, feeling a flicker of honesty. "Pushed through, just a weird night." She nodded slowly, as if she understood more than she was letting on. "We all have those nights," she murmured, more to herself than to me, her gaze drifting back to her coffee. The rest of the day passed in a similar haze. Every time I thought I was alone, I'd catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, her expression always lingering on something unspoken. I couldn't figure it out, and every time I tried to push for an answer, she'd quickly brush it off as if I was imagining things. By evening, I was at my limit. I felt like a tightly coiled spring, ready to snap, every nerve on edge. That was when I noticed her heading upstairs. Her footsteps were slow, almost hesitant, and I found myself following. Unable to resist the pull of curiosity, she disappeared into her room, and before I could think it through, I was knocking softly on the door. She opened it, looking mildly surprised to see me there, but she didn't seem upset. If anything, she seemed expectant, like she'd known I'd come. "Do you want to come in?" she asked softly, her tone gentle, almost hesitant. I nodded, stepping inside, and glancing around. Her room was familiar, yet felt different. as if the air itself was heavier. Here she closed the door behind me and gestured toward the armchair by the window. But instead of sitting there herself, she settled on the edge of the bed, watching me with that same unreadable expression. The silence between us grew thick and tense until I couldn't take it anymore. "Mom, is something wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, you've been acting different." She looked down, her fingers playing with the edge of the blanket. "I don't know." She began, her voice soft, wavering slightly. "Maybe it's just me. Things have felt strange lately, haven't they?" I nodded, feeling a pang of relief that she understood that she felt it too. "Yeah, they have," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Last night it felt like someone was in my room." Her gaze snapped up, surprise flickering across her face. For a moment she seemed to be at a loss for words, her mouth opening slightly as if she wanted to say something but thought better of it. "It's probably just your imagination," she finally said. But her voice held a strange hesitation, as if she wasn't entirely convinced of her own words. "Sometimes we imagine things, especially when we're feeling tense." She let out a sigh, her shoulders slumping slightly as she looked out the window, lost in thought. I wanted to press further to ask what was really on her mind, but something held me back. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something, like one wrong move could push everything into chaos. The conversation faded, leaving a thick silence between us. I wanted to bridge the gap to understand what she wasn't telling me, but the words felt heavy, lodged somewhere deep inside. So I just sat there, watching her, feeling the distance between us grow wider with each passing second. Eventually she stood, crossing to the window and pulling the curtains back. She stared out into the darkening sky, her face bathed in the soft, fading light. "You know," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "sometimes we can't control everything. Sometimes things happen, things we don't understand." The words hung in the air, filling the silence with a weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I wanted to ask her what she meant, to dig deeper, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the feeling that whatever lay beneath her words was something I wasn't ready to face. I left her room that night with more questions than answers. The tension between us felt like it had only grown thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers, something I couldn't quite grasp. The days that followed were a blur. We danced around each other, each conversation laced with unspoken words, each glance filled with the attentions that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I tried to focus on my routine, on the small, familiar details of daily life, but it was impossible to ignore the growing distance between us. Then one evening everything changed. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling as sleep eluded me once again. The house was quiet, and the familiar sighs and groans had become almost comforting. I was drifting into that strange space between wakefulness and sleep when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving down the hallway. My heart began to race, a mixture of anticipation and dread filling me. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the footsteps came closer, stopping just outside my door. I waited, my breath shallow, the seconds stretching out like eternity. And then the door opened just a crack, enough for a sliver of light from the hallway to spill into the room. I lay there feigning sleep, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what would happen next. The door opened a bit more and I felt presence enter the room. I didn't dare move, didn't dare open my eyes, but I could feel her standing there, watching me. Time seemed to slow, each second dragging out, and I fought the urge to speak, to break the silence. Finally, I felt her approach, her footsteps soft against the carpet. She stopped beside the bed, and for a moment the room was filled with nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat. Loud and insistent in my ears, she hesitated, her presence hovering close as if she was waiting for something. I stayed still, holding my breath, every muscle tense. I could feel the weight of her gaze, a mixture of emotions that I couldn't quite name. And then, after what felt like an eternity, she reached out her fingers, brushing lightly over the edge of the blanket. The touch was so soft, so tentative that I almost wondered if I was imagining it. But the warmth of her hand was real, grounding me in the moment, making everything feel sharp and immediate. A shiver ran through me, but I remained still waiting, unsure of what would come next. The air between us was thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. She didn't move, didn't pull away, just stayed there, her hand resting lightly on the blanket as if she was waiting for some kind of sign. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Sometimes I don't know what I'm doing." The words were soft, almost broken, filled with a vulnerability that caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if I even should. But the tension between us, the unspoken words, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid hung in the air, pressing down on me. And then, just as suddenly as she had entered, she withdrew her hand and turned, slipping out of the room without another word. The door clicked softly, shut behind her, and I was left alone in the silence, my heart still racing, my mind spinning with questions. That night sleep didn't come. I lay there staring into the darkness, replaying every moment, every word, every touch. The tension between us had reached a breaking point, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The days following our talk were filled with a strange sense of anticipation, as though something was waiting just out of sight. Each interaction with her felt like it was layered with unspoken words, a shared understanding that neither of us dared to voice. It was as if we were dancing around something fragile, something that, if named, would change everything. One evening I was sitting in the living room reading when she walked in. She paused, glancing at me, and for a moment I felt that same tension between us flare up again. She offered a slight smile, the kind that didn't fully reach her eyes, and settled down on the couch beside me. The silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but charged, like we both knew there was something we wanted to say but couldn't find the words. After a while, she looked over, her gaze meeting mine. "Do you remember how we used to stay up late talking about everything?" she asked, her voice soft, nostalgic. "I missed that." I nodded, feeling a strange warmth spread through me. "Yeah, I miss it too," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. She shifted slightly, leaning closer, her presence filling the space between us. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, familiar and comforting, and I felt my heart begin to race. She looked at me, her expression soft, her gaze holding something I couldn't quite name. For a moment, we were just there, caught in the quiet, sharing a closeness that felt both familiar and entirely new. Her hand reached out, resting gently on my shoulder. "You know you can talk to me, right?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "About anything?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I know," I replied, feeling the weight of her hand on my shoulder, grounding me. She smiled, her hand lingering there for a moment longer before slipping down her fingers, brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was soft, barely there, but it sent a shiver through me. I felt the warmth of her fingers against my skin, and I found myself drawn to her, pulled in by the quiet understanding that passed between us. "I'm glad," she said, her voice gentle. "I want you to know that I'm here." Her words hung in the air, filling the silence with a warmth that wrapped around us. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Instead, I simply leaned closer, letting the moment speak for itself. After a while she turned slightly, her face just inches from mine. Her gaze softened, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her, pulling me in. I don't know what came over me, but in that moment everything else faded away. The room, the silence, the tension, all of it dissolved, leaving just the two of us sharing a connection that felt both new and inevitable. Slowly I leaned in, our faces so close I could feel her breath warm against my skin. She didn't pull away. Instead she stayed, her gaze locked on mine, a softness in her eyes that took my breath away for a heartbeat. We just remained like that, caught in the stillness, as if the world had paused around us. Then, as if drawn by an unseen force, our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss. The touch was gentle, barely there, but it held a warmth, a quiet intensity that made my heart pound for a moment. Nothing else existed, just the warmth of her lips against mine, the softness of the kiss, and the feeling that this was right, that we were meant to share. This moment we couldn't control ourselves. Everything happening between us felt inevitable. Our bodies met, wrapping around each other, melting into the emotions that swirled between us. When we finally pulled back, she looked at me, her gaze filled with something I couldn't quite name. There was a vulnerability there, a sense of something fragile and unspoken, and I felt my heart ache with the weight of it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking down, her cheeks flushed. I didn't mean for that to happen, but I shook my head, reaching out to take her hand. "You don't have to apologize," I murmured, my voice soft, reassuring. "I'm glad it happened." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. It feels complicated," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want things to change between us." I squeezed her hand, offering her a gentle smile. "Things have already changed," I said, my voice steady, "but that doesn't have to be a bad thing." She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips, and for the first time in days, the tension between us seemed to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding. We sat there in silence, holding hands, letting the moment wash over us, filling the room with a warmth that felt both new and familiar. The days that followed were filled with a newfound closeness between us, a shared understanding that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. There were no more awkward silences, no more unspoken words hanging between us. Instead, we found ourselves drawn together, sharing quiet moments that spoke volumes. One evening we were sitting together on the couch talking about nothing and everything. Our laughter filled the room, a sound that felt both comforting and freeing. She looked at me, her gaze filled with a warmth that made my heart skip a beat, and I felt myself being drawn to her all over again. "Witho," thinking, I leaned in and she met me halfway, our lips meeting in a soft, lingering kiss. This time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just the warmth of the moment, the feeling that this was where we were meant to be. Her hand slipped into mine, her fingers intertwined with mine, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. We stayed like that for a long time, lost in each other, sharing a closeness that felt both familiar and entirely new. And in that moment I knew that this was just the beginning, that we were standing on the edge of something beautiful, something that would change us both forever. The passing days were filled with an odd sense of calm, a quiet understanding that settled around us. Our connection had deepened, weaving itself into our lives in ways both familiar and new, as though it had always been there waiting to be noticed. There was no need to discuss it. We shared a kind of wordless understanding, each moment spent together carrying a warmth that felt grounding, steady. One evening we found ourselves outside, sitting in the yard as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a gentle glow over the house and the trees. She leaned back watching the sky, her face softened by the fading light. The warmth of the day had given way to a cooler breeze, and we sat in the quiet, wrapped in our own thoughts. She glanced over, catching my gaze, and offered a small smile, one that spoke volumes. "Do you ever feel life like things were meant to be this way?" she asked softly, her gaze drifting to the sky as if seeking answers among the stars. I considered her words, the honesty in her voice, stirring something inside me. "Sometimes," I replied, feeling a quiet certainty settle over me. "I think things have a way of working themselves out, even if we don't understand it right away." She nodded, her hand resting gently beside mine on the bench. Our fingers brushed a just casual touch, but it held a meaning, a sense of connection that went beyond words. It was in these simple gestures, these quiet moments, that I felt the depth of what we shared. No grand declarations, no need for explanations, just an understanding that this was where we were meant to be. As the stars began to emerge, filling the sky with a soft glow, we stayed there side by side, wrapped in the stillness of the evening. The world felt vast, open, but in that moment it was as though we had created our own small universe, a space just for us, untouched by anything else. The days went on like this, each one blending into the next, our connection deepening with each passing moment. We found ourselves spending more time together, sharing quiet conversations, laughter, and the occasional touch that lingered a moment too long. It was as if the walls between us had disappeared, leaving us with nothing but a closeness that felt both new and timeless. One afternoon we decided to take a drive. It was her idea, a suggestion to get away for a while, to leave the familiar surroundings of the house behind and explore something new. The drive was filled with light conversation, easy laughter, the kind that comes from shared comfort and familiarity. We took the winding roads, the sun casting a warm glow over the hills, filling the car with a sense of peace. We drove until we reached a small overlook, a place where the world stretched out before us in endless green hills and blue skies. She looked at me, her eyes bright with excitement, and suggested we step out to take in the view. We stood there together, leaning against the car, watching the world unfold before us, vast and endless. There was something freeing about it, a sense of openness that matched the way I felt with her, like anything was possible, like we were standing on the edge of something beautiful and new. She looked over at me, her gaze soft, and I felt my heart skip a beat. There was a warmth in her eyes, a quiet joy that seemed to mirror my own. Without thinking, I reached for her hand, our fingers intertwining in a gentle, familiar way. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's beautiful out here," she murmured, her gaze drifting back to the view, her voice filled with a sense of peace. "Yeah," I replied, though my attention was focused entirely on her. There was something about the way she stood there, the way the sunlight danced across her face, that made me feel like I was seeing her. For the first time, she glanced over, catching my gaze, and for a moment everything else faded away. The world around us disappeared, leaving just the two of us caught in a moment that felt both endless and fleeting. Without a word, she leaned in, resting her head against my shoulder. I wrapped an arm around her, holding her close, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. There was a quiet intimacy in the gesture, a sense of belonging that filled me with a peace I hadn't known before. We stood like that for a long time, watching the sun sink lower in the sky, the colors fading into the soft blues and purples of twilight. Eventually we made our way back to the car, the silence between us filled with a comfortable warmth. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts, but there was no tension, no unspoken words hanging between us, just a sense of contentment, of being exactly where we were meant to be. As we pulled into the driveway, neither of us made a move to get out. She looked over at me, a soft smile playing on her lips, and for a moment we simply sat there, sharing a quiet understanding without thinking. I reached out my hand, finding hers, and she squeezed my fingers gently, her gaze holding mine. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice filled with a quiet sincerity that resonated in the stillness of the car. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. For what she shrugged, looking down at our hands, for being here for everything. I nodded, words feeling unnecessary. Instead, I simply held her hand, the silence between us speaking volumes. There was no need to say anything more. Everything that mattered was already there, held in the quiet moments, the shared looks, the gentle touches. In the days that followed, things continued to grow and shift between us. We spent more time together, sharing meals, conversations, and laughter that felt both light and meaningful. Each moment was filled with a warmth, a quiet joy that made the ordinary feel extraordinary. It was as if we had created our own little world, one where nothing else mattered, where we could simply be. One evening we found ourselves in the living room, sharing a quiet moment as the world outside faded into darkness. She sat beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, her hand slipping into mine. The touch was familiar now, a simple gesture that held a world of meaning. We sat like that for a long time, wrapped in the silence, the warmth of each other's presence filling the room. There was no need for words, no need for explanations, just the quiet comfort of being together, of knowing that this was where we were meant to be. Eventually she looked up at me, her gaze soft, her eyes holding a question that needed no answer. I leaned in our foreheads, touching as we shared a moment of quiet connection, a sense of understanding that went beyond words. In that silence I felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that whatever the future held, we would face it together side by side, sharing a bond that was uniquely ours. It was a feeling of home, of belonging, one that needed no grand declarations, no promises, just the simple, undeniable truth of what we shared. And as we sat there, wrapped in each other's presence, I knew that this was something rare, something precious. It was a connection that went beyond words, beyond explanations. A closeness that would remain steady and true, no matter what came next.